Radical environmentalism is striving to put America and the world under its destructive control. Known as the Green Dragon, this philosophy is seducing your children in our classrooms and popular culture. Its twisted view of the world elevates nature above the needs of people, even the poorest and most helpless. With millions falling prey to its spiritual deception, now is the time to stand and resist. Exposing the Green Dragon examines the current status of this pseudo-scientific religious movement and reveals the truth through the light of Scripture.
I wanted to start off this particular version, or edition, I should say, of the Green Dragon, Exposing the Green Dragon, by talking to Cal Beisner. Who better to really start the program off with than Cal Beisner, who is the national spokesperson and founder of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Cal has really led the charge of exposing much that is taking place in this genre, and so we thought it would be great to have Cal on this inaugural edition of the Exposing the Green Dragon series. With that, let me go ahead and bring Cal into the conversation. I want to talk to him specifically about what's taking place in the public school science standards area. This is something that should be of concern to each and every one of us. Cal, welcome to the program today.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's a privilege to be with you. I've always enjoyed talking with you on your radio program as well. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, I think so. And as I mentioned, you're certainly the right person for us to have on the program today to talk about these issues. In fact, before we get started, would you mind just giving the viewing audience just a little bit of a synopsis as to who the Cornwall Alliance is, what's your goal, what's your mission, and when it started, a nice recap of exactly what this organization is all about.
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. The Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a network of evangelical Christian theologians, scientists, economists, and some other scholars. About 60 scholars in our network, spread around mostly North America, some other places around the world as well, who are dedicated to promoting three things at once. The first one is what we would call biblical earth stewardship, or godly dominion. We define that, or we describe that as men and women created in the image of God, laboring together to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors, so that we're really addressing the two great commandments there, to love God and to love neighbor. The second is economic development for the very poor around the world. Think especially in terms of places like, say, sub-Saharan Africa or Haiti and certain other parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, to promote their economic development through free markets, through free trade, limited government, private property rights, civil rights, and especially the gospel of Christ, because frankly, the Christian faith has been one of the most important generators of economic development in the history of the world. And then the third that we are promoting is the Christian faith itself, particularly the gospel of Jesus Christ. That Christ died on the cross for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again from the dead on the third day, according to the Scriptures, this being Paul's summary of the gospel in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And we do this, all of this, in a world that is permeated by an environmental movement that has a worldview, theology, and ethics that are overwhelmingly anti-Christian, whose science and economics are very often very poorly done, whose policies therefore often really don't do much good for the natural world, but are very harmful to economies, especially to the poor, and that is also intentionally infiltrating Christian churches to, as many of them put it, to green the gospel, And the result is that you're winding up with substitute doctrines of God and creation and humanity and sin and salvation. And unfortunately, even many evangelicals are beginning to be susceptible to embracing this message. Taking good care of the earth is obviously a good thing to do. We are called to be good stewards of this earth. That's inherent in our name, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. But we need to be very careful that we don't just simply bring ideas in from the outside world and sprinkle a little bit of Christian terminology on them and think that that makes them Christian. The Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 to test all things, hold fast what is good. And we as Christians need to do that with great care, especially with the environmental movement.
Cal, let me ask you then two fronts. One, are you extremely concerned about the growth of the green movement throughout our society and world today? And secondly, are you encouraged by the amount of interest and the amount of resources that have been made available in order to combat what we see taking place all around us?
I'd say on the first count, yes, I'm quite concerned about the growth of the green movement. The Cornwall Alliance just recently published a new paper on the tremendous amount of evidence that there is directly from federal Form 990s. That's a particular sort of tax return that nonprofit organizations have to file, showing that very liberal foundations, usually foundations that are heavily committed to population control and the environmental movement around the world, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Marilla Foundation, Tides Foundation, Ford Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and so on. Many of these foundations have been giving literally millions and millions of dollars to evangelical organizations in support of their environmental activities. And I'm not suggesting that the folks who run the evangelical organizations have sold out, so to speak, but one has to recognize that these foundations put their money in places that they think will advance their own agendas. And that suggests that there is some question as to whether the evangelical groups that are being funded by them are being adequately discerning about the kinds of policies that they embrace and promote. So yeah, I'm quite concerned about the growth of the movement. It is a worldwide thing, and part of what concerns me about it is the distortion that it brings to Christian teaching. Part of it also is the huge harm that it brings to the poor, especially in developing countries around the world. As for the second part of your question, I see a growing awareness of the need to be careful about this. I would love to see much more rapid growth in the actual learning and teaching of what needs to be done about this. I'm very grateful the Lord has blessed the work that the Cornwall Alliance is doing. We've had, frankly, an impact that is far beyond our very small budget and our very small staff, and we're very grateful to the Lord for that, and particularly grateful to the 60-some scholars who form our network, whose time is volunteered when they write papers or articles for us, when they review things, when they advise me. It's out of the love of their hearts for the Lord and people whom they're serving. So we're grateful for that. I can point to one particular thing that I think has been a great development. It's a brand new documentary film called Blue, produced by J.D. King, who's a young documentary filmmaker living in Montana. And it's a really excellent expose, excellent not just in its content, but also in its performance, in the aesthetic feature of it. It's got some good humor, but it's also got a great deal of really excellent information. And he's interviewed top scholars from around the world on not just the case against, say, climate alarmism, but also other aspects of environmentalism, including the political aspects and the element of environmentalism that is attempting to push toward a one world government. So that's been very good, and by God's grace, the Cornwall Alliance had a significant hand in the planning of that documentary, and we've been wanting to promote it as much as we can.
Well, it sounds like that there has been some work done, but there's a lot of work still to go. And I hope that a broadcast like this will help in that effort as well. I wanted to ask you very specifically about the idea of public school science standards. We all know that how indoctrinated school children became as a result of the dogma or the teachings of Darwinian thought that was introduced and became a staple diet of the curriculum in public school systems. Should we be concerned now about the green movement getting its tentacles into the public school system as well?
Environmental thought is becoming almost ubiquitous in the public school curriculum, all the way from kindergarten right on up through high school. It enters into the natural sciences, into the social sciences, into history, and so on. It's a very powerful movement. Several years ago, the state of Maryland became the first state in America to require, quote, environmental literacy, unquote, for high school graduation. One would have thought it would have been nice for them just to require basic literacy to graduate from high school, but I guess perhaps there's a danger in that, because people who are truly literate, who can not just simply manage to read, but actually know how to read and understand and really think through a text. Having a lot of people who are truly literate is a dangerous thing for those who want to be in control of other lives. Real literacy leads to freedom of thought and to real inquiry and curiosity and even skepticism, which is a very good thing, a biblical thing, as I quoted earlier, Paul saying that we should test all things, hold fast what is good. That Maryland's example there has been followed by some other states as well, and so environmental curriculum is spread all through our schools now, particularly with regard to the next generation science standards, which you mentioned. These are very loaded with environmental issues, particularly with a press for the acceptance of the idea of very dangerous man-made global warming. Catastrophic anthropogenic global warming is one way to refer to it. This is presented not as something that is in fact an issue of significant scientific debate, which it certainly is, but rather as a totally unanimous conclusion of scientists. It's very much the same way that Darwinism was forced on the American public through the public schools as well. But there are some other problems with the next generation science standards as well. One of the things that is required in all public school curriculum, according to Supreme Court rulings, is religious neutrality. That is, you can discuss religious issues in public school curriculum, but only if the discussion is totally neutral. If it's not going to be neutral, then you can't discuss them at all. Well, the next generation science standards is explicitly materialistic. Matter and energy is all that exists. There is no God. The universe was not created or designed or anything like that. Well, that's a religious position, and it's certainly not neutral to assert that in the curriculum. But the NGSS has that very explicitly asserted all over the curriculum, and it is assumed everywhere. So for that reason, there's actually a group, the Citizens for Objective Public Education out in Kansas, that has filed lawsuits in several different states against the next generation science standards, precisely because they don't meet the Supreme Court's requirement under the First Amendment of religious neutrality. I think that's probably going to lead to pretty clear court decisions, because the evidence within the NGSS is so overwhelming. I don't see how the courts can fail to recognize that this is a violation of the First Amendment.
How do these standards view mankind himself? We noticed a disturbing aspect of much of the Green Movement was a very low view of man, man being the problem all the time, and much of the literature that's put out, and the earth being exalted to a much higher position. Speak to that. Is that something in this particular standards that we should be specifically concerned about?
Yes, it is. In the next generation science standards, for one thing, because they're totally materialistic, matter and energy is all that exists, they don't have any room for a soul. They don't have a room for God. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to affirm that human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore have the potential for moral choice and for rational understanding of this rationally designed universe around us, to understand it as a rational God intends us to understand it. Which, by the way, when you've denied all of that stuff, which you do by taking an atheistic, secular, humanist, materialist view of the universe and of reality, all of reality, you undermine the very capacity to do science. Since science arose in history in only one time and only one place, and that was medieval Europe being what we used to call Christendom. And it arose there precisely because the biblical Christian worldview was dominant, and it recognized that you had a rational God who designed a rationally ordered universe and placed in it human beings created in his own image to be rational and to understand that universe and to be able to learn to control it through rational means. That and that alone gave rise to science as a systematic, programmatic endeavor, as distinct from occasional flashes of insight here and there, which you have in other cultures with other worldviews. But where you are materialistic in your worldview, human beings cannot be qualitatively different from any other forms of life. We are only quantitatively different. And consequently, it then makes perfect sense, for example, to illustrate this, to think about human beings and their relationship with their surrounding environment the same way you would about, say, bacteria in a petri dish. Now, we know that if you put bacteria into a petri dish that has plenty of nutrient for the bacteria, they will multiply exponentially until they have used up all the nutrient, and suddenly they will crash, and you'll have an immense die-off of those bacteria. Well, environmentalists and the materialist authors of the next generation science standards tend to see human beings just exactly the same way, which is why they're afraid of overpopulation. They see us basically as consumers and polluters, not as producers and stewards the way the Bible presents us. And therefore, they're worried about overpopulation, rather than seeing that since we are producers and stewards, we can actually enhance the environment around us. You know, amoebas and bacteria don't go out and plant farms and produce new food. They just eat what's there. Humans do, and that's a significant difference between us and them.
Cal, is it fair then to say that what we see taking place with these standards is we see politics triumphing over pure science?
Well, yes, we do see a lot of politics behind the next generation science standards. That shouldn't be terribly surprising. Granted, those who developed the standards, they are mostly members of the National Academies of Science, which, in stark contrast to most scientists around the United States and the world, most of whom are theists, at least, many of whom are specifically Christian theists, the National Academy roll out to be about 93% atheists. Also, one of the organizations that's really promoting the next generation science standards is the National, let's see, oh, suddenly its name is slipping my mind, the National Center for Biological Science or something like that. And it has been promoting Darwinism and opposing the intelligent design movement and the creationist movement for many, many years. And so that is clearly a political organization. The politicization of science is itself a significant development over the last 40 years or so. The late Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, in his farewell address, actually warned against exactly that. He pointed out that as a result, partly of the bringing of scientists into the production of military technology in World War II and years following up on World War II, government had become the primary source of funding for scientific research. And he warned that that was a grave danger because government, of course, is highly political. And therefore, you're going to wind up with funding pushing scientific research toward political agendas. And this, in turn, I think, had some impact on the development of what is called post-normal science. This is a philosophical approach to science that was pioneered by an Oxford philosopher of science by the name of Jerome Ravitz, and a Spanish thinker as well, Silvio Funtevich. And in post-normal science, what you get really is a mixing of politics with science so that you go through the motions of doing science, but your conclusions are predetermined because they have to serve a political agenda to which you're already committed. It's actually an application of postmodern deconstruction, which is a literary theory from the postmodernist movement, which tells us that language doesn't really convey meaning or truth, it only projects power. It's an application of that to the sciences, and then science becomes not an endeavor by which you seek to discover truth and to manipulate not people but inanimate objects or other animals than people. Instead, science becomes simply a process by which you seek to project power. And it's very important to find out that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been heavily, heavily shaped by adherents of post-normal science. Most important among them probably is Dr. Mike Hume, H-U-L-M-E, not like David Hume, H-U-M-E, but Mike Hume, who's former professor of climate change at the University of East Anglia in England, which became famous, by the way, for the ClimateGate scandals. Hume is a specific adherent of post-normal science. He's written, along with Jerome Ravitz, on that. And in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, he specifies that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is supposedly the world's foremost scientific authority on climate change, is a post-normal scientific institution. He tells us that in a world that is dominated by capitalism, climate change is a handy thing to come along. He says that rather than asking what climate change can do, what we can do for climate change, we should ask what climate change can do for us. That it's helpful because it can become a way to pursue a lot of our political agendas. It also so happens that Mike Hume is a Marxist. And he taught many of the top climate scientists involved in the UN IPCC. So what we really see is the IPCC, the foremost disseminator of the notion of catastrophic man-made climate change, is essentially a post-normal scientific activity in which science becomes the tool for pursuing a previously determined political agenda. That's devastating to real science. And unfortunately, because that's led to a whole lot of very inaccurate descriptions of the way the world works, the public is rapidly losing trust in climate science, but that's also spilling over into a mistrust increasingly of science in other fields, which is driving us away from the logos-driven biblical worldview, biblical epistemology, biblical theory of knowledge, more and more toward an Eastern mystical way of approaching things, and that is heavily influential in the Green movement.
I think it's worth noting that the Green movement is moving forward despite the fact that there are thousands of scientists that reject its dogma. I think also the idea that it goes against empirical facts that we can look at and test, and it doesn't line up with those things. And as we're bringing out at the beginning of the interview today, it doesn't square with solid and strong biblical account of what took place in the beginning and the way that God in his word says that we should look at the environment and man and so forth. So in all those points, it seems to be at odds. One final question here today, Cal. What should folks listening to a broadcast like this, what should they do? I would imagine one thing is they can get more information out there at the CornwallAlliance.org, but what's your recommendations for them? They watch this broadcast and they say, well, I want to help to expose and oppose what's taking place in the Green movement.
Oh, that's a great question. And boy, there's so much that can be done and that needs to be done. The first thing, of course, is pray. We must not be functional atheists, which unfortunately is the case for many of us who are Christians, or functional deists, perhaps. We certainly believe that God exists, but then we want to take everything into our own hands, figure it all depends on our fighting the battles. That's not the case. We need to pray. We need to pray that the Lord of hosts will open the minds of many, many people, give them good discernment, Christians and non-Christians alike. Non-Christians can, in fact, discover a lot of truth, and we should be thankful that they've done precisely that by the common grace of God. So prayer should be our first resort and our last resort. The next thing we need to do is we need to do some hard work of getting well educated, learning about these things. As you mentioned, CornwallAlliance.org has a great deal of information available on it. We also have a page on Facebook, Cornwall Alliance on Facebook, and so I would invite your listeners to come there and like the page and get involved in our discussions. We post multiple times every day. Other people post on it, and we have good discussions of articles about all sorts of fascinating developments in environmental science and economics and the like. They can also arrange through our website to host a Cornwall Alliance speaker at their church or school or conference of whatever sort. We're glad to provide that help. I would encourage them to take documents from our site and give them to friends. Give them to their pastors. Many pastors are so busy. It's very difficult for them to keep up with what's going on in these affairs. But we need for pastors to become well informed on this and to become active about it, and then to pass that information on to their congregations. So that would be a good thing to do. As they learn more and more, they should also be writing letters to the editors of their local newspapers. They should be contacting their elected representatives and letting them know their preferences regarding policy of all sorts. All of these things need to be done. And one of the most important things is that we need to be helping people to understand that, frankly, poverty is probably the greatest threat to the environment, because a clean, healthful, beautiful environment is a costly good. And wealthy people can afford more costly goods than poor people can. As a result, if you're worried about putting food on the table, clothes on the back, and a roof over the head, you really don't care much about smog. You don't care much about water pollution or any other kind of pollution. You certainly don't care about climate change. You care about those immediate issues of food and clothing and shelter and clean drinking water. And frankly, if you have to deforest a mountainside in order to cook your meal, you and your thousands of neighbors going out there and cutting trees to do that, well, so be it. You do it because you do it or you starve. What that means is that economic development for the poor in the developing world is one of the most important steps we can take toward improving the environment. But what history teaches us is that economic development never happens in the absence of certain basic fundamental principles of the Christian faith, including private property rights, the ability to document private property and to be able to use it as collateral in order to raise capital to be entrepreneurial, which begins to lift you out of poverty and then enables you to lift your neighbors out, plus limited government, free markets, free trade, the whole notion that government plans, that coordinated economic development is going to work. That notion has died 1,000 deaths since it became popular in the 1920s and 30s. We need to leave that behind, and we need to embrace the kind of free market economy that raised the West out of poverty, and now see it raise the rest out of poverty as well.
Well, Cal, well said. Thank you so much for the work that you do there at the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Thank you for taking time out today to talk with us today on exposing the green dragon. We really appreciate it.
You are very welcome, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being with us as we continue to examine the current status of this pseudo-scientific religious movement of radical environmentalism. With its twisted worldview elevating nature above the needs of people, we will continue to reveal the truth about the so-called green dragon. Join us next time as we continue exposing the green dragon.